always wanted to write about the First World War. I mean, genuinely, from a very young age, I remember reading some of the oral histories, actually, with the voices of the participants from the 1970s, Lynn MacDonald and Martin Middlebrook. And I got sidetracked, first of all, by the Second World War, and then going back to the wars of the Victorian period. So the centenary was an opportunity to come back to something probably I thought about doing before anything. But the novel thing is not a coincidence, actually, that this has been written in a series of snapshots, because it is difficult to write both fiction and non-fiction. I think it confuses you a little as a writer, but it also gives you ideas. Whether they're all good, I'm not sure, but I think this one was quite good, because the idea that you would tell it as in a series of short stories or snapshots seemed to me a very sensible approach for the First World War, for the very simple reason that it's incredibly complicated. The origins are complicated, the sequence of events are complicated. It's hard to explain exactly why we spent all that time fighting in the trenches, and yet at the same time not a lot happens if you look at it from a purely storytelling, narrative point of view. So to break it up to snapshots that moved in and out of the front line and went back to what was happening on the home front, and spies and revolutionaries and risings in the Arabian Peninsula, suddenly made it, in my opinion, a much more kind of readable, exciting story. It is anyway, but the trick is to make it so, and to release yourself really from the imprisonment of that trench warfare. I think as a writer, you always want to take risks. You're always looking for ways to push the boundary, even as a writer of non-fiction. And fiction allows you to do that. But when you come back from having written fiction, you have broken the rules. I think it does two things. It makes you look at the psychology of the main players much more than perhaps you would naturally do. But secondly, it forces you to tell a good story. And I don't believe there's a single writer of history and fiction who isn't a better writer of non-fiction as a result of having written fiction. I think in the choice of the 100 Days, I wanted to make sure that I didn't miss anything really important, that if you were going to read the book from start to finish, you would need to know about to get some kind of sense of how the war unfolded. So there are certain key moments that I think any history that was trying to tell the whole World War, that would be in there. But I also wanted a number of stories that frankly weren't absolutely crucial to understanding how the war unfolded, but nevertheless would give you a much broader feel of what was going on. So the story of Mata Hari, the famous spy who's Dutch-born but really was international. I mean, she could have come from any nationality, and of course she spoke so many languages. She had many lovers from all over Europe, which made her incredibly attractive to the intelligence services on both sides, because they realized she had this wonderful access to people right at the top of the military and government in pretty much every country in Europe. And that is why, without question, ultimately she ends up spying for both sides. I don't think she wanted to. I don't think it was predetermined in her mind at all that she would betray one side for the other. She was literally moving from one moment to the next, and really money was a key factor for her, and excitement. I think she'd been one of the most famous artists, maybe a better way of putting it, in Europe, and was sort of past her sell-by date. Her best days as a performer were gone. She was into her 40s, of course, by the start of the First World War. And when she got the opportunity to spy, not only for Germany against France, which was a country she'd been living in for many years and really had made the success of her career there, she took it, one, out of excitement, and two, because frankly she was broke. And this theme about money being a key motivation for spies is not unusual. We can see this across the centuries. But that story of Mata Hari enabled me to look at an aspect of the war that's not just about nationalism and pride in fighting for your country. She had none of that interest, really, and of course Holland was neutral anyway, and therefore she was fair game. And it makes you realise that actually this sense that Europe is divided between two entrenched positions is not necessarily the case. Still today, the popular perception among most Britons about the origin and course of the First World War is that it didn't really start for any good reason, and therefore the 15 million or so lives that were lost in a pretty appalling form of warfare. Because if you think about trench warfare, you've got these two fixed lines in which bodies are lying around all over the place. I mean, it's a bit like the scenario up in the South American Andes, where the plane crashes and they're forced to eat each other's bodies, and the bodies are literally lying around. Well, just multiply that and imagine the smell that they must, and imagine the circumstances in which they live, trying to stay clean and stay healthy, quite apart from trying to avoid being killed. And you've got the most unbelievably unimaginable form of warfare. And yet most British soldiers, and most soldiers on all sides for that matter, but most British soldiers, and I mean most, not all of them, most of them never had any idea that they wouldn't keep doing that. There wasn't a kind of sense of why are we all here. They actually believed that there was a good reason for them being there. And I think that's the disconnect between them and now, then and now. We think that, we imagine, because of the poet's view of the war, that actually it was a slightly pointless war. That's certainly not what they felt at the time. And I think if we're being honest about the origins of the war and the course of the war, we realise that one or two countries, effectively the central powers, Germany and Austria, were trying to take over the continent. And Britain has fought a number of wars for 300 or 400 years for that very reason, to stop one country doing that. It fits in very neatly with a long history of why we have fought on the continent. It's not that different from why we fought the Second World War, although arguably the regime in Germany was not quite as brutal, but it was brutal nevertheless. So I think if any good is going to come out of my book and other books about the First World War during the centenary, it'll be a slightly more nuanced assessment of what we were doing and whether it was worthwhile. And I think in sum, it was. As a historian, the experience I went through writing this book was probably more moving than any I've had hitherto. I've read lots of sources about some pretty grim things happening, which is inevitable, I suppose, when you're a military historian. But when it involves your own family, you can multiply that. And I think my feeling about my great uncle Hugh Neely, who dies in the Second Battle of Ypres, is can't get to war fast enough. He's writing endless letters to his sister and members of his family, his sister being my grandmother. You know, it looks like I've missed the boat this time, but there's every chance in 2 or 3 weeks I might get out there. I mean, he was champing at the bit, and what's interesting about Hugh is he wasn't alone. This was the general feeling among Britain's youth at that time. Now, call it naive because it was relatively early on in the war. You could call it naive, but it also engendered in me a tremendous sense of pride. And I'm not foolish enough to imagine I probably would have felt that differently. Now, does that mean they were all, they were all foolish to imagine that this was a glorious cause? I'm not so sure it does, actually, because what it meant is they all had a common purpose. And they had a common purpose, I think, when we break down the causes of the war, that actually was defensible and was admirable in a way. He was prepared to lay down his life. His death is pathetic. I mean, he arrives on the front line towards the end of March 1915, and by the end of April, he's dead. He hasn't even survived 6 weeks. There are eulogies in his local newspaper, the Bromley Times, which is where he came from, which is quite a salubrious part of London apparently in those days. I'm describing him as a perfect knight, and it wasn't unnecessary flattery, actually. When he was writing letters back home, they were generally letters about how he was doing his best to look after his men, and this was a generation and a kind of attitude that I think has been lost a little bit, actually. In current society. Do we need a war to cleanse ourselves? Absolutely not. But there is something, whatever people think. I think the study of the First World War and writing about my family brought this home to me. There is something very selfless about going to war and being prepared to sacrifice yourself. He died. It was a pathetic death. He was hit by a shell and spent many hours bleeding out effectively in a trench because they couldn't get him back to medical treatment, but also I did feel extraordinary pride, but incredibly moved actually when I first read those letters, because I read them for the first time during the research for the book, and I bet you there were people all over the country that these letters are lying there in someone's attic. And again, if the centenary does anything, it may bring a few more of these, these really moving family connections to what I consider to be a very important part of our history. And let's face it, the history of the 20th century is entirely underpinned by what happens in the First World War, where we go from that point. They'll be lying out there somewhere, and books like mine I hopefully will bring out a few. As we get further away from the possibility that the man in the street will actually be able to be asked to really for the ultimate sacrifice, which of course we never want to make that choice, but it is fascinating how at the beginning of the First World War in particular, people embraced that possibility. they are all of a sudden a part of a much bigger cause than themselves. And there is something, people were writing about it at the time, intellectuals were writing about it at the time. You could argue they were slightly disillusioned halfway through the war, but there is something incredibly attractive, I think, about a society all pushing together for a cause which is much bigger than themselves, but also is quite admirable and necessary. And I think that was the case in the First World War, and yet the First World War has been completely overshadowed by the Second World War, which is perceived by, again, most British people as a completely justifiable crusade against a monster. And the First World War is not seen in that light, and yet it wasn't far off that, I think. And the idea that you would be part of, i.e. everyone, and I'm not just talking about the men who went to war, I'm talking about women, children, everyone had a role to play in the war. I mean, I suppose it's one of the definitions of total war. Everyone's kind of drawn into it together. I think it created a wonderful atmosphere. We remember that atmosphere from the Second World War, but they felt it in the First. And I think, again, there's this misconception that people must have been incredibly depressed during the First World War at what was going on. But actually, on the whole, the feeling was that they were doing something worthwhile, and it was both on the home and the war front. I have to confess that the source that I was so delighted to revisit, and that I probably overmined shamelessly, was Vera Brittain's wonderful recollection of her youth and really the formation of her character during the First World War, Testament of Youth. I mean, it says it all, really. She starts off the war engaged to a very brilliant student who, just like my great uncle, can't get into uniform quickly enough. And he says to her at one point, of course, I'll feel much less of myself, a bit like Samuel Johnson, if I don't actually do my bit, if I don't experience life as a soldier. And more than that, he says that I can't imagine anything more glorious than a soldier's death. Well, again, like my great uncle, he actually has a pretty pathetic death where he's shot in the stomach and, and lingers for hours and finally dies. And what's so moving about the passage in Testament of Youth, and I do include this in the book, and I think it's one of the most moving bits of the book where it was for me to write it, is that she has arranged to meet him for Christmas. He's coming back for Christmas. There's a kind of wonderful coincidence of him getting leave at that time. He doesn't turn up. She's waiting for him. She's thinking, shall I go and meet him at the station now? Okay, I'll wait in the hotel in Brighton where her family are wintering. And he just doesn't appear. Next morning, she gets a phone call. He's gone. And then the codicil to this is the need for her to know how he died. And again, this is something similar in my own family. The endless letters that go back and forth between the bereaved and the members of the soldiers' regiment or unit or battalion, in which they're desperate to find out the detail of how they died. They need closure in some way. But what was particularly grim about the Vera Brittain story is that they actually send the uniform back. And it's when she finally sees the uniform, I think, certainly the way she writes it in Testament of Youth, that you realise that's it for her. She's finally seen the uniform. To think, that this beautiful, brilliant, wonderfully talented young man, this is all she's got left of him, this kind of stinking, mud-sodden, blood-soaked uniform. They burn the uniform, of course, very quickly, and from that point on, she has to kind of rebuild her life. But it's moments like that just sum up the universal experience, I think, for the First World War. The key to Vera Brittain, of course, is that she was able to put it into a language that we can all understand.